It's time to get a little bit spicy as I review your hottest Warcry takes. Welcome to Wargames on Toast, all of you lovely people. It's me, it's Toast. How are you doing today? So last week I approached the Warcry community and asked for their hottest Warcry takes, and the response was overwhelming. With something like 50 comments flooding my inbox, I was inundated with interesting takes to take a look at, and unfortunately I had to cut it down to just 10. But worry not, everybody will have their chance to be judged harshly by me, as I'll make multiple videos covering every other response. I am coming for all of you. So without further ado, let's check out some hot takes. Oh no, it appears you have done yourself a mischief and fallen into my trap, because before we get started, it's time for a little bit of shilling.
I am shocked. Shocked! Well, not that shocked.
Please consider leaving a like, a comment and subscribing, as that helps me fight against that dastardly YouTube algorithmic demon. And if you want to help in a more tangible way, then please consider signing up to my Patreon or my YouTube members, or using my Element Games affiliate link down below when buying some new Warcry gubbins. A huge shout out to my patrons and members who you can find on screen now. Badoosh. But with all of that out of the way, it's time to get on with the show.
And now for something completely different.
So our first comment comes from Smuckus. The counter reaction is flawed. It massively favours high strength, high toughness models. At this point, I consider 200 plus point almost useless if they don't bring strength 5. As they often become a trap when going into toughness 5 chaff, like Ossiarch models. I would largely agree with the first part. The counter reaction is incredibly flawed. It's more of a I throw this out to kind of be annoying and kind of hope that you roll badly and then I get massively rewarded for doing so. It's a I'm about to die, so I'm going to counter, and they kind of fuck you over a little bit. And it always feels bad. It's a very negative reaction I'm not a fan of, and it's because there's no actual damage cap to counter. It is very possible that your chaff will do substantially more damage just by using counter twice than they ever would swing in with their 3 or 4 attacks, right? And that just doesn't feel right. And when it comes to strength 5 on more expensive models, yeah, you kind of need it, because whilst toughness 5 chaff isn't necessarily the norm, there's enough of them around to cause a lot of issues if you just dumped a whole bunch of points onto a model that can't hurt them effectively. As a blanket statement, I'm not entirely sure I agree, because there are plenty of 200 point models that bring more than just their raw stats. Let's just take, at the top of my head, Calthea Zandaya is a 210 point model who is strength 4, who has a 5-4-2-4 profile, so quite blendy. She's a prime candidate to be countered to death, possibly, with enough attacks being thrown from her. But she has Coordinated Strike, and that is such a powerful ability that you would take her regardless of her lower strength. And of course, if your local meta runs Divine Blessings, then Strength 4 is just an avenue to Strength 5 by paying a little bit of a premium to gain the extra pip of strength. Mr. Fibble Esquire says, changing Onslaught to the next attack action rather than end of activation would make lots of the faction doubles abilities more useful. At present, Onslaught is the better option in a lot of cases. This is interesting because I don't necessarily disagree, but my solution would be a bit more extreme. So I am in the headspace right now where I don't really like the generic universal abilities in Warcry. Things like Onslaught and Rampage, they overshadow many faction doubles and quads to the point where you just don't see them all that often, especially in some of the older warbands. So my solution is twofold. One, remove them from the game entirely so there are no universal abilities at all. And then secondly, rework faction doubles and quads so they are actually interesting and good, because some are flat out bad and some warbands disproportionately need Onslaught to compete because their abilities are bad. So as much as I would like to see abilities like Onslaught changed or even removed, I think it has to be done with care, because you could be nerfing warbands that only work because these abilities exist, because their core lineup is so poor. Off the top of my head, factions like Skirk and True Blades rely on Onslaught to do anything. So removing or even just changing it or nerfing it would disproportionately affect them compared to other warbands. So there's definitely a balancing act going on there somewhere. DadSwag123 has a whole bunch here. We'll go through them now. First, shooting into combat needs to be simplified. No need to meet 2 or 3 prerequisites in order to shoot into combat. Make a rule for your friendly guy in the way, and if you fail, he takes damage. Done. I disagree with that. Shooting in Warcry is already simple. It's too simplistic, because it's disproportionately powerful because there are a lack of responses to being shot. So whilst it might be annoying that you can't shoot into combat, or if they're too close you can't shoot, the fact that there's no reliable cover system besides standing near or behind a wall of some sort to increase your toughness, which might not make any difference to your survivability at all, honestly, simplifying it even more just seems like a bad idea to me. If anything, I would do the complete opposite and actually expand the shooting rules so players have a legitimate response to shooting that isn't just, I moved into combat. His next take, some scenarios are downright garbage. I actually planned on making a 20-ish list of the best to play from. The escaping scenarios are so dumb. I completely agree here. A lot of the casual Warcry missions are dreadful. They are absolutely terrible. They're fun enough sometimes, but then you get random ones that are like, one player loses 2/3 their warband and then has to survive against their opponent's full warband for 4 whole turns. And that's not really playing Warcry, right? That's just a bit naff. And the escaping scenarios are also really easy to cheese. They're fun enough, I guess, in a casual or narrative sense, and that's really where they are limited to. The actual matched play missions in Warcry are a lot better, but even then, some of them are just downright awful. It really depends on what pack you are running, because the Ferocious Gnarlwood 2 pack, which came out for a Warhammer World Tournament, which is I think now in circulation as their go-to pack, is actually really solid. But prior to that, there was a pack in White Dwarf that had a lot of really questionable decisions that was not fun, and the actual core missions in the Warcry rulebook are also not that fantastic, with some key exceptions. I think Ley Lines is pretty fun, and Hidden Vault is also pretty darn good. And as a general rule, I'm going off on here, as a general rule, there are no good treasure missions. They are all terrible, and anybody who says otherwise is factually wrong. So there's also that. Take number 3, the game needs a little more balance and maybe some defense rules. That one is a maybe. Yeah, that maybe is a big maybe. I don't think Warcry needs defense rules. There is one faction that I can think of off the top of my head that has them, and that is the Ruination Chamber. So they're brand new and they have them kind of in the form of lightning scoured souls, I believe it is, Badoosh. And that's actually a really powerful ability. If you get it off, your guys become much, much harder to kill, and on Stormcast, they're already hard to kill, so I like it as a one and done. Like, if one faction has it and it doesn't become prominent, I'm absolutely fine with that. It's an interesting design space to explore in a single faction. I would not like to see defense rules or armor saves or anything like that appear on a wider scale. I think that takes away from the slickness of Warcry's combat. One rule to rule them all is the system I like, and I don't really want to see that change. The game needing more balance is interesting because, on the one hand, yeah, all games, including Warcry, could do with some more balance because no game is perfectly balanced. So having regular updates to improve that is definitely a thing I am all for. And we see that now. We didn't get an FAQ from Games Workshop really for about 2 years, and now we've gotten 2 in 6 months. So that's really damn cool, and I am all for more of that. But on the other hand, balance is tricky because people are very prone to being stagnant, and this is a side effect of the hobby being fairly expensive, because it's difficult to pivot to adjust your own list to deal with current meta picks, the top picks, and make a more of a counter list to the meta, because that costs money, it costs time in building and painting, and that's not necessarily something everyone can do. So having something that's imbalanced is disproportionately impactful on a game like Warcry, but at the same time, a lot of the balance issues in Warcry can just be solved by building better lists. And that's not meant to be a dig, and frankly, this is a hot take of my own here. A lot of the things that people think are unbalanced actually aren't. They're usually kind of fine, and the issue can often just be pilot skill and inexperience, and calls for balance changes aren't always coming from the right place. Hot take number 4, we're going to need another edition sooner than later with the amount of FAQs we have. This is really interesting as a take because we've had very few FAQs in Warcry. We had like one at the start, which changed monsters. We had one shortly after that changed Rampage and not much else. And then there was nothing of note for like 2 whole years. And then we received 2 FAQs in the last 6 months, which is fantastic because it shows that Warcry is getting support from Games Workshop beyond just product, right? Buy product and that's it. It's no, we're actually making efforts to improve the game. And I don't think we've had enough FAQs. And honestly, I don't think Warcry needs or will get a 3rd edition anytime soon. I think we're going to be stuck in 2nd edition for quite some time, and we may never see the dawn of 3rd, which is a topic for another time. And Dad Swag 123's final hot take: I personally love being able to use most of my models from Age of Sigmar and the Underworld models, as they're always killer sculpts. I just don't like how Bladeborn are included into a list. I can absolutely get down on that. I completely agree. I think Bladeborn in particular are incredibly clunky to add to a list for new players, because they are allies, but they're also in faction, but they're also not allies, and also you can't take any of them unless you take one guy, then you can take all of them. And their rules are largely impossible to find from Games Workshop. You have to use third-party resources like warcry.net to even get a clue as to what any of these things do or what they are, their stats, their abilities, and it's not good. And then on top of that, the vast majority of Bladeborn can't be bought anywhere other than eBay, because Games Workshop's Underworld model is to cycle out sets constantly as if it was a card game. So they're really awkwardly included. And the final nail in the coffin for Bladeborn is that so many players don't even know they exist, which is crazy to think about. But yeah, most people don't actually know Bladeborn are a system used in matched play, and people are shocked when Eflim and his Pandemonium drop on the board, or the thrice full Discord appear with their meta-breaking Vexmo or something. So there's definitely a lot of space to fix Bladeborn, and I don't know what the solution would be, sadly. Going on to our first Patreon comment, we have Lord Philax. 2 things. First, we would all be in a much better place if folks spent half the energy they do complaining about Bladeborn organising some darn games. There is definitely an issue in Warcry where there just isn't a lot of organised play. I, for one, can't get a game of Warcry in my local area. I have to play TTS or travel about 3 hours down south to find anything near me. And that feels bad. So yes, transferring the energy used to complain about Bladeborn, which is one of the most common complaints that Warcry players have, into just playing the game is something I'm definitely all for. That being said though, Bladeborn do have some huge, glaring and obvious issues that need discussion and, more importantly, just need some fixing in one way or another. Secondly, complaining about too many profiles and options is bad for the consumer and gives less avenues for folks to enter the game. I think it ultimately comes from people getting used to Games Workshop not balancing their games correctly unless they butcher the available options. Games Workshop can balance a game of any size and they can figure out a solution for model availability, they just choose not to. Complaining about too many profiles and options is bad for the consumer and gives less avenues for folks to enter the game. That is the only part I kind of agree with, but at the same time there are too many profiles. There are 1,600 plus profiles in Warcry, and there's just way too much bloat. And this comes from a lot of places, Bladeborn being one of them, but also the compendium just being filled with completely superfluous options that no one will ever take. For example, having 3 or 4 weapon options for one chaff model is simply unnecessary. You could cut that down to 2 easily. This even applies to bespokes. Look at Quest or Soulsworn. They have an axe, a spear, a sword, and a hammer, and 3 out of 4 of those operate in the same space, have nothing unique about them beyond their stats, and you could simply cut the axe and then you're fine. And then people who build the axe can just say it's a hammer. Like, it's a 2-handed hammer or an axe. A Quest or Soulsworn with big honking beatstick would be a good enough profile. There's no need to have the axe. Nobody is going to run the axe. The axe is terrible. It is simply bloat. Slice it out or change it. And then coming back around it again is bad for the consumer and gives less avenues for folks to enter the game. I don't think Bladeborn are an avenue to enter the game. I think they just aren't, because you can't buy them. If you are playing Underworlds already, yes, you have an avenue into Warcry. But Underworlds is also a niche game that is possibly even smaller than Warcry. So how many players are really getting into Warcry from Underworlds who aren't already in Warcry from Underworlds or from Age of Sigmar? I don't think there's that many. And the argument that you have an extra avenue into Warcry, I think is just kind of false when you can't buy most of them. Games Workshop have like 3 or 4 kits on their website at any given time, and the other 50 trillion Underworlds factions are completely unavailable, or you have to go through eBay and then pay 3 times the price just to get them. And yes, Games Workshop could just reprint them, but that's a logistics issue that I don't think anyone here is really qualified to comment on, beyond saying that Games Workshop is a tiny company in an even smaller pond, and the logistics behind just printing more models out is a lot more complex than I think many people give them credit for. So yeah, Filx buddy, I love you man, but I can't get behind that. Sorry to say. Next up we have Patron Vegas. Elf profiles need higher toughness. I disagree. Elf profiles need more wounds. Toughness would not stop them from being one-shot by just about anything. Having at least 10 wounds should allow them to survive 1 extra hit on average in combat, which is always nice. It also helps counteract the fact that they die to counter because they have more wounds to burn before counter murders them. And one of the issues with elves is that they attack a lot at low strength with low damage, and counter murders them every single time. So for me, wounds would be the better option. So my wife Stephanie says Toast doesn't do enough work and should do more.
You make me sick!
Going on to some YouTube comments, SockJack86, despite being the mechanically superior game with better models, Warcry will never have the longevity of Mordheim because it lacks the customization and central location tying the game together. Ooh, that's a spicy one. So Mordheim is a enigma wrapped in a riddle because Mordheim is both surprisingly popular but also completely impossible to get to. It's basically dead. It is a basement game where you play with your friends whilst drinking beer and eating pretzels, and most people who are even my age, who are in their 30s, have probably never had a chance to play Mordheim. So the fact that it still lives is very impressive, and I agree. I don't actually think Warcry will have the niche longevity of Mordheim because not many games do. Mordheim is definitely one of those few games that have survived the test of time, despite the system itself being a little bit shite, if I do say so myself. But I don't necessarily think the lack of customization or the central location really matters because Warcry has had a central location now for the past 2 years, and that's a meat forest, and it's not the best location, granted, but that's a central location. In terms of customization, because there's plenty of customization in Warcry, both narratively and competitively, because narratively, there are countless ways to upgrade and customize your warband through renown and experience points and all that good stuff. And competitively in match play, you have allies and Bladeborn and thralls and monsters and huge selections of units to pick from, which is kind of cool. And I think that's enough customization to justify saying that Warcry has enough customization in some way. But if all that's the case, why do I think that Warcry won't have the longevity of Mordheim? That's because Warcry has a incredibly negative perception problem. New players don't know what Warcry is, new players don't even know that Warcry exists. The vast majority of players who are playing Spearhead right now for Age of Sigmar actually don't even know Warcry is a thing because the praise Spearhead gets is largely focused on how short it is to play and how quick it is to play and how small scale it is. But Warcry has been there the whole time and does Spearhead better than Spearhead if I were to be so bold. So yeah, unless Warcry fixes its perception issue, I don't think we're going to get the same level of continued fan support and adoration as Mordheim when Warcry finally bites the dust. So the penultimate hot take is by Debus. Debus. Bladeborn warbands should either be massively rewritten or cut off in the next edition. Some of the most recent ones are genuinely interesting and can add fun tricks to your list. Ephelim's Pandemonium, Skabix Placeseeker, Zundara's Gravebreakers. I agree, all those are fantastic. But most of the pre-Harrowdeep ones are just regular units, but straight up worse or better or the exact same. Warcry is progressively getting bloated with profiles that nobody uses, and Bladeborn are largely at fault. I'll stop there. Yes, to all of it. The vast majority of Bladeborn and Warcry are just a thing that already exists with a completely superfluous change in stats. Like, this guy's a basic guy, but with +2 wounds that no one cares about, no one takes, because it's just not worth the extra 10 points or whatever Games Workshop judge 2 wounds to cost. And then you throw in the fact that a lot of these older Bladeborn warbands don't have any abilities at all that are worth using, or are so situationally restrictive that you're paying points for what is basically nothing, and then throw in the fact that you can't buy these models anywhere but eBay, and yeah, it's massive amounts of bloat that could absolutely be cut. And sure, the massive changes to Bladeborn points values in the recent FAQ has made some of the lesser played or completely unknown or unplayed Bladeborn more usable. For example, Morgoth's Crushers is now seeing play in Destruction Soup because you can now take 2 brutes for 1 ally slot for a fairly low price and get a lot of wounds on the board with you messing, and that's pretty darn good. But yeah, for the most part, they could mostly all just be cut, and it's sad for people who have those models, but nobody's stopping you using those models as just cool sculpts for the regular things they're based off of anyway. Right? I've never seen the issue with that. Like, they're cool sculpts. Use them as cool sculpts. Like, what? Moving on. Or maybe make them more restrictive by basically making them regiments of renown, so that you have to take the whole warband in your list if you want to get them. That way you can still have fun tricks of Bladeborn whilst maintaining viability for regular profiles. That is a really, really fun and interesting way of fixing Bladeborn. But also, I think it would just mean that no one takes Bladeborn. Because some Bladeborn warbands are so expensive, you basically have nothing left. So you might not be able to legally take some, which is interesting. But also, having a restriction that drastic would just mean that you won't take them. Even the very best Bladeborn, people are not going to take an entire Bladeborn warband to take them, because there's usually too much guff in there to make it worthwhile. So I think that would just basically end Bladeborn as an idea entirely. You might as well just cut them all off at that point. But that being said, my stance comes from a competitive perspective. Take this idea, have it in narrative and more casual play, and then that's actually really cool, because now you can have some pretty cool looking warbands with some pretty cool named characters. And I love named characters. I play the Black Talons because they're all just named dudes. I also play the Saviors of Cinderfall because they are pretty darn cool named dudes. And I like that in my Warcry, and Bladeborn filling that role would be pretty cool, even though I do think it would be the death of them in any serious competitive sense. And finally, it is the legend himself of meta musings. Probably an unpopular take. Most of the cries of "I can't beat X, X is broken, the meta is stale, X is too strong or too weak" are actually a product of players not wanting to change how and what they play, as opposed to those things being actually true. Absolutely yes, 100% in every conceivable way. This is crazy spot on. I said it before, because of the hobby we're in, that the what they play is always going to be an issue because of the cost of adding things to a list or changing your list's makeup over time. It costs time and money, and that's an issue. However, the first part of players not wanting to change how they play, absolutely. This is so unbelievably true. I have played hundreds and hundreds of games of Warcry, and the honest truth is that many people don't actually adapt to anything. They have their list that may or may not have been net listed, and then they have a game plan that they use in every single game. And when that doesn't work, then the thing they played against is broken. And this is demonstrably not true. And like I said before, it's mostly down to player skill, and not to toot my own horn, although tooting will be had unintentionally. Anecdotally, I have played nearly every warband in Warcry. I have ran the F-iest of F tiers. I've ran Cypher Lords, pre-update Corvus Cabal, Askig and True Blades, you name it. And in every one of those situations, yeah, it's been a struggle to land the win, but it's never been impossible. And it was simply a case of, I need to approach the game differently. I need to leverage my strengths and play differently, not just like run my toughness 3 made of paper Cypher Lords into a gun line of Caradon Overlords, because that's just stupid. But that's how 90% of players who would run Cypher Lords would do that matchup. They would just run in, because that's how you play Warcry. That's how most people play Warcry. And the complaints that this faction or this model is broken or the meta's boring, like, change the meta. Metas aren't meant to be stagnant. They're not meant to be static. They're meant to change. If something is really strong in Warcry, everything in Warcry has a counter it. Like, run the thing that makes dealing with that thing easier, right? Currently we're in a meta that is shrinking. It is a small, elite, mid-rangey focused meta that is very high on its ability to kill you very, very quickly. It is a very brutal meta right now in the competitive scene. How do you counter that? You take warbands that have more chaff. You take warbands that can hoard, that can flood the board more. Things like Tarantula's Brood, who have been for years considered to be absolutely dreadful, not by me by the way, I've played them many times and I love them dearly, have now come into prominence after myself playing them a lot, and proving they are very good, and recently off-meta musings himself coming in and winning a very stacked event with Tarantulas Brood. And that's because he did exactly what he said here. He changed what he played and then threw in a healthy dose of player skill, and then badoosh, you get 4 wins and become the Southampton champion. Obviously, I'm coming from this from a very competitive perspective. Not everyone goes to tournaments, so maybe this advice just doesn't apply. Well, in that case, you need to talk to your local group, right? The meta is stale, but the meta is not international. The meta is local, right? Your local meta could be different to my local meta, or to the US meta, or to the TTS meta, right? It's all different, and if you're going into Warcry with the expectation of playing a casual game of Warcry, running some one-box bespoke lists and just having a good time with some mates, and they're running something hyper-tuned and competitive, the solution is simply to talk to your group and arrange something a little bit lighter. And that's the end of these hot takes. There are plenty more I'm going to go through, and I'll do more videos in the future on them. It's interesting that so many hot takes in this video touched on Bladeborn, Bloat, and Balance, and it really gives insights on the wider Warcry community's thoughts on Warcry and where it is right now. And whilst I don't necessarily agree with all of them, the fact that there are so many that this is a recurring talking point is very, very interesting, and I would love to be a fly on the wall at Games Workshop HQ if and when they ever decide to address any of this. But that's the end of this video. A huge thank you to everybody who has responded, and if you have responded but you didn't appear on this episode, be on the lookout for future episodes where you could appear there instead. Be sure to hit like and subscribe, and to comment down below what you think of my hot takes and what you think of other people's takes on this video, or even just drop your own hot takes right now. And until next time, lads, ladies, and everybody in between and beyond, ta-ra.
Groovy.
Boy howdy, it's Toast, and it's time for the post-Toast credits. A huge, huge shout out to my algorithmic demon slayers, Andy Morris, blah blah blah, Head Knight of Paint, Heinz D, Keep Lang, Long Run Hobbies, Lord Filax, Sable Saber, Mrs. Toast, Steve Bean, the Houston Toad, Tough, Tootin' Baby, and Velas. As always, thank you so much for supporting the channel. I'll see you all next time.